Shabbat Shalom, everyone. One of my favorite things that I get to do is I teach Parsha Club at Hillel for first graders every Tuesday. It's great. There's a lot of asking for spoons and asking me if it's okay to go to the bathroom. And it's about a 20-minute experience, and I would say about 5 minutes of it, we're really digging in on the Torah. And yet, the exercise every week of thinking about what lesson can we glean from the Torah is really helpful for me. And it often gets me thinking already at the beginning of the week, what am I wrestling with in the Torah this week? So for Parshat Toldot, I found that the kind of ethical and moral complexity of the story was really hard to communicate to first graders. Because on the one hand, it's a story of our patriarch, Jacob, beginning his journey towards his destiny. And on the other hand, it's a story about a brother cheating his other brother out of what seems to be rightfully his. The part of the Parsha that we read this morning, because we read on the triennial, we're reading the last third of the Parsha, is the part where Esav finds out what has been done to him, and the pain that he expresses is so raw. And what happens throughout our tradition is that the rabbis seek to remedy the pain that has been caused to Esav by explaining all of the ways that he was on some level deserving of having the birthright taken from him. That he's not the proper heir to the story of the Jewish people. And in a sense, the story had to go in this direction. Somebody had to make the hard decision of swapping Jacob's and Esau's destiny. And that is how we become the Jewish people that we are. But what's so striking to me is that we can tell stories in many ways. There are many ways to tell a story. And when you're speaking on a first grade level, it's typical to try to make heroes and villains out of a text. But by the time we become adults, we're capable of much more complexity. We're capable of understanding that even when we win, someone else might lose, and we have to deal with that. We have to find ways to tell our story that can both celebrate who we are and also have space for the pain and the suffering that our story sometimes causes others. And I think in today's Parsha, that truly comes to the fore. So first, I want to look quite closely at two of the verses in our text. First, and both of these are from before where we started our reading today. So in case you were reading along closely in the English, you didn't see these verses. So in chapter 27, verse 4, we first hear that Isaac intends to bless his son, and we hear it as the command that Isaac makes to Esav. And what he says is, you should go out into the field and prepare a dish for me to eat. And he says, Ba'avor tevarecha nafshi, so that I can bless you from my nefesh, from my spirit. And the translators translate this as saying, I want to give you my innermost blessing. And what I think we can start to hear in this is the kind of integrity that he wants to bless him with. He wants this to be a blessing. Integrity is like the integration of the self. So he wants to give him a pure blessing that truly comes from him to his son. And when Rivka, a few verses later, tells Jacob about his father's intention to bless Esav, she does something very interesting. In verse 27, she calls it not a bracha nafshi or birkat nafshi, a blessing from the innermost place, but rather she says that Isaac intends to bless Esav lifnei Hashem, before God. The commentators pick up on this. They say each time that Isaac's blessing is talked about, it's called the Birkat Nafshi, the innermost blessing, except in this one moment when Rivka explains to Jacob that he is going to, in fact, take this blessing. And I want us to think for a moment about the character of Jacob and what he must be feeling. He has already tricked his brother out of his birthright. This is the second time that he's being asked to take something from his older brother. Rivka's motivation is clear. Rivka has actually been told in prophecy when she was pregnant with the two children that the younger was going to surpass the older. So we might think of Rivka as just working to fulfill the prophecy that she has been given, and that, in a sense, is her motivation. That she's coming from a place of having a bigger picture of what needs to happen, and she's willing to cause suffering to her son for the sake of the prophecy. But for Jacob, who is the instrument of this suffering, what's he feeling in this moment? Can you imagine being told that you're going to receive an innermost blessing, a blessing from the most authentic, integrated place from your parent, but you're going to do it through deception? I can't think of a more complex emotional place to arrive at this important moment than what it seems Jacob is being asked. And I believe that that is why Rivka tells him not that he's going to receive this innermost blessing, but rather he's going before God to receive the blessing. Rivka is trying in this moment to connect Jacob to the bigger picture of the life that she knows he has to inherit. And in a sense, Rivka wants to make sure that he receives this authentic blessing from Isaac, but she also knows that Isaac can't give the same blessing that he would give to Esav, to Jacob. One of the commentators, Radak, the Kimchi, picks up on this discrepancy and says that the reason that she tells Jacob to go before Hashem instead of saying to go and get this blessing of the innermost place is that she knows that the blessing that Yaakov was going to be giving Esav was an unusual, critical importance, one that would reflect a prophetic utterance by Yitzchak. She knows that it has to be authentic and it has to be rooted in whatever Isaac intends to give to his generations, and yet she also knows that it has to be Jacob who receives it and not Esav. She even says, I will take the curse upon myself. Just go and do this thing. Take the blessing that I know you need to have. And I will suffer the moral consequence of having done this through trickery. In the end of our story, Jacob successfully takes the blessing. We hear Isaac say to Esav, he came through trickery, but he took the blessing and I gave it so authentically that I can't even take it back. I've truly transferred my intention that he be the inheritor of the blessing of our people to Jacob, and I can't change that story. The least he can do when he hears the grief of his son is give him a blessing of his own, find something authentic that he can promise him. And what he promises is, you will, in fact, serve the younger, but someday you'll break free from it. Not that you'll overcome him, but that you will have also a story of your own that will be separate from his. The thing that I want to highlight is that both this story and the Haftorah that we read today, which is actually a special Haftorah, not usually coupled necessarily with this parsha. In both of these stories, there is a meta story of what needs to happen for the Jewish people. We are made to believe that King David needs to be the next king, not the descendants of Saul. But the son of Saul goes behind his father's back and supports King David, this future king, in spite of it undermining his own family. In a sense, both of these stories of what Rivka does and of what Jonathan does are stories of undermining our own closest people for the sake of some bigger thing that we think needs to happen. And what I want to leave us with, first of all, is just the moral, ethical complexity of these stories, that we should be able to look at them and not just drush them away by faulting the character of the people who are hurt. That is actually what the rabbis do. They make Saul into a bad guy, and they make Esav into a bad guy, a villain. And yeah, that's one way of dealing with moral complexity. But I think the more courageous work, and I think what actually is open to us as contemporary complex thinkers, thanks in part to fiction and novels and the way that we see we can actually hold such complexity in the way we tell stories, is to look at both of these stories and to be present with the grief of the person who suffers. Esav had to be overcome. It had to be Jacob's story and not Esav. We weren't meant to be the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Esav. We were meant to be the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And yet when we hear Esav's cry in this week's Parsha, we don't have to look away from it. We can be present with his grief. We can understand that he's been hurt. And we can also own that our story had to be this way. I hope I've left you in some moral complexity. I think unlike the first graders, who I made them kind of land on a cliffhanger because I hadn't come all the way through to this, I hope that we can appreciate that we're actually able to tell our stories in this way, because I think that it's a resilient act to be able to hold not just the triumph and the failure, but also the ways that our story impacts us and each other. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.